what have you been up to today? Had any exciting adventures? How's the homeschooling going? Is everybody in your house still alive? Right, so we're going to go for chapter 3 of Alan Garmer's The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, and this is called The Maggot Breed of Ymir. "And what did old Selina Place want with you?" said Gowther at tea. "Selina Place," said Colin. "Who's she?" "You were talking to her just before you came in, and it's not often you see her bothering with folks." "But how do you know her? She seemed a stranger round here, because she stopped to ask the way to Macclesfield." "She did what? But that's daft. Selina Place has lived in Alderley for as long as I can remember." "She has?" "Aye, hers is one of the big houses on the back hill. A rambling barn of a place it is, stuck on the edge of a cliff. She lives alone there, with what's supposed to be 3 dogs, but they're more like wolves to my way of thinking, though I couldn't rightly say as I've ever seen them. She never takes them out with her, but I've heard them howling of a winter's night, and it's a noise I shanna forget in a hurry." "And that was all she wanted? Just to know how to get to Macclesfield?" "Yes. Oh, and she seemed to think that because we'd only recently come to live here, we'd want a lift. But as soon as she saw you, she jumped in the car and drove away. I don't think she's quite all there." "Happen you'd better have a word with yon," said Bess. "It all sounds a bit rum to me. I think she's up to something." "Get away with your bother. Dick Thornycroft's always said as she's a bit cracked, and it looks like he's right. Still, it's as well to keep clear of the likes of her, and I shouldn't expect any lifts if I were you. Now then, from what you tell me, I can see as you've been a tidy step this afternoon. Let's start near the beginning, and then we shanna get ourselves lost. Well, yon place where you say there was such a grand view is Stormy Point, and the cave with a hole in the roof is the Devil's Grave. If you run round there 3 times widdershins, old Nick's supposed to come up and fetch you." And so, throughout their meal, Gowther entertained Colin and Susan with stories and explanations of the things they had seen in their wanderings, and at last, after frequent badgering, he turned to the subject of the wizard. "I've been saving the wizard till the end. Yon's quite a long story, and now tea's finished, I can talk and you can listen, and we needn't bother about aught else." And Gowther told Colin and Susan the legend of Alderley. "Well, it seems as there was once a farmer from Moberley as had a milk-white mare. And from that day to this, no one has ever seen the gates or the wizard again." "Is that a true story?" said Colin. "There's some as reckons it is. But if it did happen, it was so long ago that even the place where the iron gates are supposed to be has been forgotten. I say yon's nobbut a legend, but it makes a fair telling after a good meal." "Yes," said Susan, "but you know our father has always said there's no smoke without fire." "I happen he's gotten something there," laughed Gowther. The meal over, Colin and Susan went with Gowther to take some eggs to an old widow who lived in a tiny cottage a little beyond the farm boundary. And when they were returning across the Ridings, which was the name of the steep hill field above highmost Redmoney, Gowther pointed to a large black bird that was circling above the farmyard. "Hey, sithee yon carrion crow. I wonder what he's after. If he dunna shift himself soon, I'll take my shotgun to him. We dunna want any of his sort round here, for they are a right menace in the lambing season." Early in the evening, Colin, who had been very taken with the legend of the wizard, suggested another walk on the edge, this time to find the iron gates. "Aye, well, I wish you luck. You're not the first to try, and I dunna suppose you'll be the last." "Take coats with you," said Bess. "It gets chilly on the top at this time of day." Colin and Susan roamed all over Stormy Point and beyond, but there were so many rocks and boulders, any of which could have hidden the gates, that they soon tired of shouting "Abracadabra" and "Open Sesame," and instead lay down to rest upon a grassy bank just beneath the crest of a spur of the edge and watched the sun drop towards the rim of the plain. "I think it's time we were going, Colin," said Susan, when the sun had almost disappeared. "If we don't reach the road before dark, we could easily lose our way." "All right, but let's go back to Stormy Point along the other side of the ridge just for a change. We've not been over there yet." He turned, and Susan followed him over the crest of the hill and into the trees. Once over the ridge, they found themselves in a dell, bracken and boulder-filled, and edged with jutting rocks, in which there were cracks and fissures and small caves, and before them a high-vaulted beechwood marched steeply down into the dusk. The air was still and heavy, as though waiting for thunder. The only sound, the concentrated whine of mosquitoes and the thick, sweet smell of bracken and flies, was everywhere. I don't like this place, Colin," said Susan. "I feel that we're being watched." Colin didn't laugh at her as he might have normally done. He too had that prickly between the shoulder blades, and he could easily have imagined that something was moving stealthily among the deep shadows of the rocks, something that always managed to keep just out of sight. So he gladly turned to climb back to the path. They had moved barely a yard up the dell when Colin stopped and laughed. "Look! Somebody is watching us." Perched on a tall rock in front of them was a bird. Its head was thrust forwards, and it stared unwinkingly at the two children. "It's the carrying crow that was round the farm after tea," cried Susan. "Oh, talk sense. How can you tell it's the same one? There are probably dozens of them about here." All the same, Colin did not like the way the bird sat hunched there so tensely, almost eagerly, and they had to pass it if they wanted to regain the path. He took a step forwards, waved his arms in the air, and cried, "Shoo!" in a voice that sounded woefully thin and unfrightening. The crow never stirred as much as a feather. Colin and Susan moved forward slowly, longing to run, but somehow held by the crow's wicked eye. And as they reached the centre of the dell, the bird gave a loud, sharp croak. Immediately a shrill cry answered from the rocks, and out of the shadows on either side of the children rose a score of outlandish figures. They stood about 3 feet high, and were man-shaped, with thin, wiry bodies and limbs, and broad, flat feet and hands. Their heads were large, having pointed ears, round saucer eyes, and gaping mouths which showed needle-sharp teeth. Some had pug noses, others long, thin snouts reaching to their chins. Their hides were generally of fish-white colour, although some were black, and all practically hairless. Some held coils of thin black rope, while out of the caves advanced a group carrying a net woven in the shape of a spider's web. For a second the children were rooted to the ground, but only for a second. Instinct took control of their distracted wits. They raced back along the dell and flung themselves through the gap into the beechwood. Bony fingers clawed, and black ropes hissed like snakes, but they were through and plunging down the slope in a flurry of dead leaves. "Stop, Sue!" yelled Colin. He realised that their only hope of escape lay in reaching open ground, and the path that led from Stormy Point to the road, where their longer legs might outdistance their pursuers, and even that seemed a slim chance. "Stop, Sue! We must not go down any further! Find Stormy Point! Somehow!" All the while he was looking for a recognisable landmark, since in the fear and dark he had lost his bearings, and all he knew was their way lay uphill and not down. Then through the trees he saw what he needed. About 100 feet above them, and to their right, a tooth-shaped boulder stood against the sky. Its distinctive shape had caught his eye when they walked past it along a track coming from Stormy Point. "That boulder! Make for that boulder!" Susan looked where he was pointing and nodded. They began to flounder up the hill, groping for firm ground, with hands and feet beneath the knee-high sea of dead leaves. Their plunge had taken them diagonally across the slope, and their upward path led away from the dell, otherwise they would not have survived. The others had come down skimming lightly over the surface of the leaves, and had found it difficult to check their speed when they saw the quick change of direction. Now they scurried across to intercept the children, bending low over the ground as they ran. Colin and Susan doubled their efforts. Slowly they gained height, until they were at the same level as the pursuit, then above it, and the danger of being cut off from the path was no longer with them. But their lead was barely 10 yards, and shortening rapidly, until Colin's fingers, scrabbling beneath the leaves, closed round something firm. It was a fallen branch, still bushy with twigs, and he tore it from the soil and swung it straight into the leading bunch, which went clamouring head over heels into those behind in a tangle of ropes and nets. This gained Colin and Susan precious yards and seconds, though their flight was still the stuff of nightmare, for unseen twigs rolled beneath their feet, and leaves dragged leadenly about their knees. But at last they pulled themselves onto the path, their hearts pounding and the breath sobbing in their lungs. "Come on, Sue," Colin gasped. "Run for it! They're not far behind now!" The children drew energy from their fear and ran along the track for all they were worth. Far above their heads a bird cried harshly 3 times, and at once the air was filled with the rapid, urgent beating of a gong. The sound seemed to come from a great distance, yet it was all about them, in the air and under the ground. Then they ran clear of the trees and on to Stormy Point, but their relief was short-lived. For whereas till that moment they had been fleeing from 20 or so, they were now confronted with several hundred of the creatures as they came streaming out of the devil's grave like ants from a nest. Colin and Susan halted in dismay. Gone was their last hope of reaching the road. The way was blocked to front and rear. On their left was the grim beechwood. To the right, an almost sheer slope dropped between pines into a deep valley. But at least there was no known danger there, so the children turned their faces that way and fled, stumbling and sliding down a sandy path, till at last they landed at the bottom, only to splash knee-deep in the thick black mud and leaf-mould of the swamp that sprawled unseen down the opposite wall of the valley and out across the floor. They lurched forwards a few paces, spurred on by the sound of what was following all too close behind, but then Susan staggered and collapsed against a fallen tree. "I can't go on," she sobbed. "My legs won't move." "Oh, yes, you can. Only a few more yards." Colin had spotted a huge boulder sticking out of the swamp a little way up the hill from where they were, and if only they could reach it, would offer more protection than their present position, which could hardly be worse. He grabbed his sister's arm and dragged her through the gurgling mud to the base of the rock. "Now climb!" And while Susan painfully hauled her body up to the flat summit, Colin put his back to the rock, like a fox at bay turning to face the hunt. The edge of the swamp was a mass of jostling bodies. The rising moon shone down on their leathery hides and was reflected in their eyes. Colin could see the white shapes spreading out on either side to encircle the rock. They were in no hurry now, for they knew that escape was impossible. Colin climbed after his sister. He ached in every muscle and was trembling with fatigue. When the circle was complete, the creatures began to advance across the swamp, moving easily over the mire on their great splayed feet. Ever closer they came, till the rock was surrounded by a sea of grinning faces. From all sides at once the ropes came snaking through the air, as soft as silk, as strong as iron, and they clung to the children as though coated with glue, so that in no time at all Colin and Susan fell helpless beneath the sticky coils, and over them swarmed the mob, gleefully pinching and poking, and binding and trussing, until the children lay with only their heads exposed, like 2 cocoons upon the rock. But as they were being hoisted onto bony shoulders, it seemed as though a miracle happened. There was a blinding flash, and the whole rock was lapped about by a lake of blue fire. The children could feel no heat, but their captors fell, hissing and spitting, into the swamp, and the clinging ropes charred and crumbled into ash, while pandemonium broke loose through all that fell assembly. Then from the darkness above a voice rang out over the surging crowd. "Since when have men children grown so mighty that you must need meet 2 with hundreds? Run, maggot breed of Ymir, ere I lose my patience." The crowd had fallen silent at the first sound of that voice, and now it drew back slowly, snarling and blinking in the blue light, wavered, turned and fled. The dazed children listened to the rushing feet as though in a dream. Soon there was only the rattle of stones on the opposite slope, then nothing. The cold flames about the rock flickered and died. The moon shone peacefully upon the quiet valley. And as their eyes grew accustomed to this paler light, the children saw, standing on a path beneath a cliff some way above them, an old man, taller than any they had ever known, and thin. He was clad in a white robe. His hair and beard were white, and in his hands was a white staff. He was looking at Colin and Susan, and as they sat upright he spoke again, but this time there was no anger in his voice. "Come quickly, children, lest there be worse than farts aboard, for indeed I smell much evil in the night. Come, you need not fear me." He smiled and stretched out his hand. Colin and Susan climbed down from the rock and squelched their way up to join him. They were shivering in spite of their coats from recent exertions. "Stay close to me. Your troubles are over, though I fear it may only be for this night, but we must take no risks." And he touched the cliff with his staff. There was a hollow rumble, and a crack appeared in the rock, through which a slender ray of light shone. The crack widened to reveal a high, narrow tunnel leading down into the earth. It was lit by a soft light, much the same as that which had scattered the mob in the swamp. The old man herded Colin and Susan into the tunnel, and as soon as they were past the threshold, the opening closed behind them, shutting out the night and its fears. The tunnel was quite short, and soon they came to a heavy, iron-studded oaken door. The children stood aside while the old man fumbled with the lock. "Where high magic fails, oaken iron may yet prevail," he said. "Ah, that has it. Now, enter and be refreshed." And that is where we finish for tonight. The next chapter is the Funding Delve, in which we stay in the rock a little longer and learn a little bit more about wizards. Good night.